Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one time, and one time only, to remove yourself from my property." The words came out low and even, a parade ground rumble I had not used in years. It felt foreign in my own throat, a tool from a life I had purposefully left behind. She stood there, a thick, plus-sized woman stuffed into a powder blue polo shirt that was losing a desperate war with her midsection. The shirt bore a ludicrously overwrought logo, a single, sterile-looking pine tree encircled by the words, "Whispering Pines Estates, a community of distinction." Her name tag, pinned precariously to the strained fabric, read, "Karen, President." "This is not a request," she snapped, her voice a grating symphony of entitlement that scraped at the quiet morning air. "This is an official notification. Your vehicle, that rusted piece of junk." She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward my 1968 Ford F-100, which was parked a good 50 feet inside my own property line, "is in violation of Section 12, subsection C of the community bylaws regarding abandoned and unsightly vehicles. It is a visual nuisance, and it is negatively impacting the property values of our residents." I looked from her puce-colored face, beaded with sweat under the Georgia sun, to my truck. It wasn't rusted. The seafoam green paint was faded, yes, worn thin in places by 50-plus years of honest work, but it was my grandfather's truck. I had spent the better part of my first year of retirement lovingly restoring the engine and chassis. It was parked on the grass, under the shade of a black walnut tree that was probably growing before her entire subdivision was even a pencil line on a developer's map. "Ma'am," I repeated, the calm beginning to feel less like a choice and more like a necessary containment protocol. "You seem to be operating under a significant misapprehension. Your bylaws, your community, and your authority end precisely at that line of survey stakes 200 feet behind you. This is Thorne's Stand. It has been in my family since 1888. It is not, nor has it ever been, a part of Whispering Pines Estates." She produced a sound that was half scoff, half snort. "Legal technicalities. We have a visual easement. Your blight is visible from our walking trail. It's an eyesore. I have received numerous complaints. You have 24 hours to have it removed, or I will have it towed at your expense. Consider this your final warning." She turned then, a maneuver of considerable torque, and marched back toward the manicured path that snaked through her kingdom of beige houses and identical, chemically green lawns. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of her cheap, cloying perfume hanging in the air like industrial fallout. I looked at my truck, then at the sprawling forest that was my home, and then back at the sterile homogeneity she represented. She had not just threatened my property, she had declared war on my peace. And for a retired colonel of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, that was a profound mistake. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you think this is insane, hit that subscribe button right now and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've got your own HOA nightmare story, I definitely want to hear about it. Now let me tell you how this all started. My retirement was not a surrender. It was a long-planned strategic withdrawal to a prepared position. After 30 years of managing logistics, construction, and deconstruction in some of the least hospitable places on the planet, I wanted nothing more than the deep, resonant quiet of my ancestral home. Thorne's Stand was 15 acres of what the developers called unimproved land. I called it perfect. The heart of it was a spring-fed creek that burbled over smooth stones, a sound that could wash away the memory of whining generators and distant artillery. The house was stone and heart pine, built by my great-grandfather, and it stood solid against the Georgia heat and the occasional hurricane. It was my fortress of solitude. The construction of Whispering Pines Estates on the adjacent 200-acre parcel had been a necessary evil. I had protested the zoning variance, of course, citing the impact on the watershed, but the county commissioners were seduced by the siren song of an expanded tax base. So I watched as they scraped the earth bare, replacing rolling hills and mixed pine forest with a grid of identical, oversized houses on lots barely big enough to contain their own shadows. They were monuments to impermanence, built of vinyl siding and oriented strandboard, and they looked as if a strong wind might send them tumbling into one another. I had no quarrel with the people who moved in. They were mostly young families seeking what they thought was the suburban ideal. My quarrel was with the very concept of a homeowners association, a petty government in miniature that promised order but so often delivered tyranny. From my porch, I could see the little dramas play out. A resident being lectured for leaving his garbage can out an hour too long. A notice being taped to a door because a garden hose was not coiled in a perfect, concentric circle. It was a level of micromanagement I found baffling. In the core, we had regulations for a reason: to keep people alive and to ensure missions were completed. The HOA's regulations seemed designed solely to enforce a crushing, soul-deadening conformity. The architect of this conformity was Karen. I learned her name from a welcome packet that had been mistakenly left on my doorstep. It was a glossy, professionally printed affair full of rules and admonitions. Her picture was on the inside cover, a forced, toothy smile under a helmet of blonde, aggressively sprayed hair. She was the inaugural president, a position she seemed to relish with the zeal of a newly crowned dictator. Our first direct interaction had come 2 months prior to the incident with the truck. She had appeared at my property line, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like nervous hostages. The issue then was my spring. "This pond," she had said, using the word like an epithet, "is an unapproved water feature. It is a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a potential liability. According to our environmental covenants, all standing water must be properly mitigated." I had simply pointed to the steady flow of water running out of it and into the creek. "Ma'am, that is a natural, artesian spring. It has been here longer than the state of Georgia has been a state. It is the headwaters for Thorn Creek, which is a protected waterway. And again, your covenants have no jurisdiction here." She had huffed about consulting her lawyer and had retreated, but it was clear she saw my property not as a separate entity, but as a rebellious province that needed to be brought under her control. My refusal to acknowledge her authority was, in her mind, an act of insurrection. The truck was simply the next phase of her campaign. After she left that morning, issuing her ultimatum, I didn't get angry. Anger is a hot, inefficient emotion. It leads to tactical errors. What settled over me was a cold, dangerous calm, the same feeling I'd had years ago when a critical bridge project in Afghanistan was threatened by insurgent activity. It was the feeling of a complex problem presenting itself, a problem that required a methodical, multifaceted, and overwhelming response. I went inside, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat down at my grandfather's old roll-top desk. It was time to plan a counteroffensive. The first salvo in her paper assault arrived 3 days later. The mail carrier, a friendly woman named Brenda, handed me the envelope with an apologetic look. "Looks official, Colonel," she'd said. It was. The envelope itself was made of a thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper designed to convey unearned importance. In the top left corner, The Whispering Pines logo was embossed in gold foil. It felt ridiculously heavy in my hand. I slid it open with a letter opener I'd fashioned from a spent .50 caliber casing. The document inside was even more pretentious. It was titled, in an ornate, flowing script, Official Notice of Covenant Violation and Remediation Order. The paper was the same heavy bond, and the text was filled with the kind of pseudo-legal jargon that amateurs use to sound intimidating. It cited 3 specific violations. Violation 1. Section 12, subsection C, Maintenance of Vehicles. This section pertained to my F-100, which it described as being in a state of disrepair and visual degradation. It demanded its immediate removal from the community viewshed. Violation 2. Section 8, subsection A, Landscape and Foliage. This was a new and breathtakingly audacious charge. It cited my property for failure to maintain an approved horticultural aesthetic. It specifically mentioned the overgrowth of unmanaged timber and the presence of non-ornamental ground cover, which I took to mean the native ferns and wildflowers that grew in the understory. Violation 3. Section 15, subsection F, Unsanctioned Construction. It accused me of maintaining an unapproved and non-compliant outbuilding. They were referring to my grandfather's smokehouse, a small, solid structure of fieldstone and cypress that had stood for over a century and still smelled faintly of hickory and cured ham. At the bottom of the page, a figure was listed under Initial Penalties Assessed, $500. A subsequent line warned that fines would accrue at a rate of $50 per day until all violations were fully remediated. It was signed with a flourish by Karen, President, Whispering Pines Estates, HOA. I read the letter twice, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. This was not a simple threat. It was a target package. It was a documented admission of her intent and a perfect example of her gross overreach. She had provided me with my first piece of evidence. I went to my study and pulled a large olive-drab footlocker from the back of the closet. The stenciled letters on the side still read Thorn MJCOE. Inside, beneath old uniforms and memorabilia, were the tools of my former trade: protractors, topographical maps of forgotten places, and stacks of fresh, new in wrapper 3-ring binders. I took one out. It was a heavy-duty D-ring model, 3 inches thick, with a clear plastic sleeve on the cover and spine. I sat back down at my desk and printed a crisp, clean label in a simple sans serif font. On it, I typed 2 words: Operation Spring Freedom. I slid the label into the binder's spine. Then I took the violation notice from Karen, placed it in a plastic sheet protector, and clipped it into the binder. It was Exhibit A. This binder would become my field manual, my opposition research file, my entire campaign plan contained within a single volume. Every piece of correspondence, every photograph, every note, every scrap of research would find a home here. Amateurs attack with emotion. Professionals attack with documentation. Karen had fired the first shot in a paper war, and she had no earthly idea how badly outgunned she was. The slow, dangerous calm I had felt earlier solidified into something harder, something purposeful. The peace of my retirement was over. The siege of Whispering Pines had begun. The first phase of any successful campaign is reconnaissance. You do not engage the enemy until you know the terrain, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. My first objective was to acquire a copy of the Whispering Pines Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&Rs, their own rulebook. A quick search of the county's public records website yielded a full PDF of the document, filed at the time the subdivision was platted. I printed all 87 pages and spent the next 2 days dissecting them. I read them the way I used to read engineering specifications for a new combat bridge, looking for load limits, stress points, and fatal flaws. I highlighted passages in 3 different colors. Yellow for procedural requirements the board had to follow, pink for rules that were vaguely worded or legally unenforceable, and orange for anything that represented a potential contradiction or internal hypocrisy. By the end of the second day, the document looked like a Christmas tree. Her case was riddled with weaknesses. The section on visual nuisance, for example, was so broadly written as to be almost meaningless, a classic sign of amateur drafting. The enforcement process she was required to follow, a written warning, followed by a formal hearing, followed by a board vote, was something she had completely ignored in her direct ultimatum to me. But the real smoking gun wasn't in her rulebook at all. It was in a much older, much more powerful document. I drove down to the county courthouse, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. In the records office, I requested the original plat maps for my property and the parcel that became Whispering Pines. A clerk brought out the heavy, oversized books, and I carefully unrolled the crisp, aging linen paper. There it was, in the clear, precise hand of a county surveyor from 1958, when the larger parcel was first subdivided. My 15 acres, designated as Lot 1, with its boundaries defined by meets and bounds, referencing iron pins and ancient oak trees. The adjacent parcel, Lot 2, was the one sold to the developers. Crucially, the plat map for Whispering Pines, filed 40 years later, explicitly referenced the 1958 survey and showed its own territory beginning precisely at the boundary line of my land. There was no easement, visual or otherwise. My property was legally and historically as separate from hers as France is from England. I paid for certified copies of both maps. They went into the binder. Operation Spring Freedom, Section 2. Terrain Analysis. My next step was to escalate the conflict to a higher authority. Karen was operating her little HOA like a sovereign nation. It was time to remind her that she was subject to state and federal law. Her primary obsession seemed to be my spring. I started with the Georgia Department of Environmental Protection. I got a bored-sounding man on the phone, his voice weary with the weight of 1,000 bureaucratic battles. I calmly and methodically laid out the situation. I own a property with a natural artesian spring that is the headwaters for a state-recognized waterway, Thorn Creek, I began. I have received a written demand from the president of an adjacent homeowners association to mitigate this spring, which I interpret as a demand to fill it in. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The weariness in the man's voice was suddenly gone, replaced by a sharp, metallic edge. "Excuse me, sir? Can you repeat that? They want you to do what?" "Fill it in. Destroy it." She called it an unapproved water feature. I could hear him typing furiously. "Sir, could you give me the name of this homeowners association and its president?" I did. "And your parcel number?" I gave him that as well. "Colonel Thorne," he said, his tone now one of grim camaraderie. "Under Title 12 of the Official Code of Georgia Annotated, the Georgia Water Quality Control Act, what she is demanding is a felony. The intentional destruction or diversion of state headwaters carries a fine of up to $50,000 per day and potential jail time. We take this sort of thing very, very seriously." He gave me a case number and the name of a field investigator who would be in touch. He finished by saying, "Colonel, whatever you do not touch that spring. And if you see anyone from that HOA on your property attempting to do so, call 911 immediately and then call us. We will handle it from there." I thanked him and hung up. I wrote down the case number, the statutes he cited, and his name on a fresh sheet of paper. It went into the binder. Section 3. External Assets. With the legal and environmental high ground secured, it was time to move to the next phase: building a resistance. A single complaint can be dismissed as a disgruntled individual. A chorus of complaints becomes a movement. I knew from my observations that Karen ruled by fear and that there had to be other residents who chafed under her thumb. I just had to find them. I decided to take a walk. I put on a simple polo shirt and a baseball cap and strolled into the pristine, curving streets of Whispering Pines. It was like walking onto a movie set. Every lawn was a perfect green carpet. Every shrub was trimmed into a perfect sphere or cube. There wasn't a child's toy or a stray leaf in sight. It was unnervingly sterile. My first target of opportunity was an elderly woman tending her flower beds. Her home was immaculate, but in the center of her prize-winning roses was a small, brightly painted garden gnome. As I got closer, I saw a piece of paper, protected by a plastic sleeve, staked into the ground next to it. It was a violation notice. The gnome, apparently, was an unapproved lawn ornament. I stopped at her walkway. "Morning," I said. "That's a beautiful garden." She looked up, her face a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Oh, thank you," she said, wiping a gloved hand on her apron. "It's my pride and joy." Or it was. She gestured to the notice. "Now it's just another problem for Karen." "I'm Marcus Thorne. I live on the old property next door." Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, you're the Colonel. Karen talks about you at the board meetings." "I can only imagine," I said with a dry smile. "I received one of her letters myself. Seems she has an issue with my trees, and my smokehouse, and my grandfather's truck." I paused. "My name is Mrs. Gable, and it's not just the gnome. It was the bird bath last month. The flag I fly on Memorial Day was, and I quote, not of an approved size. It feels like I can't do anything right." "Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice low and serious, "you've done nothing wrong. The problem isn't your gnome. The problem is a president who has forgotten that she serves the community, not the other way around. I'm putting together some information to address this. Would you be willing to share your story with me? Just the facts, the notices you've received." A flicker of hope appeared in her eyes, quickly followed by a shadow of fear. "I don't want any more trouble. The only way to stop a bully," I said gently, "is to stand up to them. But you don't have to do it alone." She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice firmer. "Come inside. I've kept every single one of them." I spent an hour with Mrs. Gable photographing each of the 7 petty violation notices she had received over the past year. They went into the binder. Section 4. Insurgent Support, Subsection A. My next stop was a house where a young family, the Martinezes, lived. I knew they were a target because I'd seen Karen berating the young father, David, in his own driveway about the color of his daughter's swing set. I found David in the garage, trying to fix a lawnmower. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. His reaction was not fear, but a weary, simmering anger. "Man, I'm so sick of her," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "We got a notice that our daughter's slide is an unapproved shade of primary yellow. It has to be earth tones. Earth tones. She's 5. She likes yellow." Then we got fined because our basketball hoop was left at the curb for 2 hours after trash pickup. It's constant. We feel like we're living in a prison camp. I listened, I nodded, and I documented. I took a photo of the offending yellow slide. I took a photo of the new violation notice taped to their door. I explained to David what I was doing, gathering facts, building a case, not on emotion, but on a pattern of harassment and abuse of power. "If you fight her, we're with you," David said, his jaw set. 100%. I left his house with copies of his documents and a growing sense of momentum. I now had allies. I had the seeds of a rebellion. The binder was getting thicker. Karen's isolated campaign against me was about to become a multi-front war, and she still had no idea. Even with a solid operational plan, superior intelligence, and burgeoning local support, a wise commander knows when to bring in specialized assets. My expertise was in engineering and logistics, not litigation. It was time to call in the cavalry. It was time to hire a lawyer. I didn't want just any lawyer. I wanted a specific type, someone who understood strategy, who appreciated meticulous preparation, and who wouldn't be intimidated by bureaucratic bluster. I found him on the third try. David Chen was a partner at a small but highly respected firm in the city. His online biography was concise and to the point. 20 years in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, retired as a lieutenant colonel, now specializing in property law and civil litigation, with a particular focus on HOA disputes. He was perfect. I called his office and scheduled a consultation. The receptionist told me to bring any relevant documents. I smiled. "I'll do that," I said. A week later, I walked into the polished, quiet lobby of Chen's law firm. I was carrying the binder. It was now nearly 4 inches thick and weighed at least 10 pounds. When I was shown into David Chen's office, he rose to greet me. He was a sharp, fit man in his late 50s, with a calm, analytical gaze that told me he missed nothing. "Colonel Thorne," he said with a firm handshake. "David Chen. Please have a seat." I sat and placed the binder on the expansive mahogany desk between us. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. Chen raised an eyebrow. "Relevant documents, I presume?" "This is Operation Spring Freedom," I said simply. "It's the complete intelligence package on my dispute with the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association." He leaned forward, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. "Operation Spring Freedom? I haven't heard that kind of terminology since I was at Fort Bragg." He opened the binder. For the next 30 minutes, he didn't speak. He just turned the pages, his focus absolute. He examined the violation notice, my annotated copy of the CC and RS, the certified plat maps, my notes from the call with the DEP, the statutes I had looked up, and the neatly organized evidence of harassment against Mrs. Gable and the Martinez family, complete with photographs and copies of their violation notices. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to something that looked suspiciously like delight. When he finally looked up, he closed the binder and leaned back in his chair. "Colonel," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This is not a collection of documents. This is a kill box. In 20 years of practicing law, both in and out of the military, I have never had a client walk in with a more thorough, more precise, or more devastatingly effective piece of opposition research. You've done 90% of my job for me. I believe in being prepared, Mr. Chen." "Call me David," he said. "And what you've prepared for here is not just a defense, it's a counter-assault. This woman, Karen, has not only acted outside of her authority, She has done so in a way that exposes her and potentially her entire board to significant personal liability. The demand to fill in the spring is a state-level environmental crime. Her harassment of residents is a clear breach of her fiduciary duty, and asserting authority over your land that is demonstrably not part of her association, constitutes tortious interference. The plan we devised was simple and elegant. We would not engage in a protracted battle of angry letters. We would send one and only one communication. It would be a legal counter-salvo, designed not to invite negotiation, but to inform the enemy of their precarious position and give them one single opportunity to cease hostilities and retreat. David drafted it while I was in his office. It was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. The letter was addressed to Karen personally, as well as to each member of the HOA board. It began by stating, in no uncertain terms, that my property was not subject to their authority, citing the enclosed certified plat maps as indisputable proof. It then addressed the violation notice I had received, systematically dismantling each claim. It informed her that the demand regarding the spring had been reported to the Georgia DEP and that an active case file, number such and such, was now open. It cited the specific statutes she was demanding I violate. It stated that any attempt by any agent of the HOA to set foot on my property would be treated as criminal trespass. It addressed the harassment of other residents, noting that a clear pattern of abuse was being documented. The final paragraph was the payload. It stated that if any further attempts were made to fine me, lien my property, or otherwise interfere with my quiet enjoyment of my home, we would immediately file a civil suit seeking not only damages, but also the recovery of all legal fees. And it explicitly named Karen and each board member as individuals who would be held personally liable, piercing the corporate veil of the HOA due to their reckless and potentially illegal actions. This letter, David explained as he printed it on his firm's letterhead, is designed to do one of two things. A sane person will read this, contact their attorney, and be told to retreat immediately and apologize profusely. A person like your Karen, however, a person blinded by arrogance and a lust for petty power, she will likely view this as a declaration of war and escalate. We're hoping for the latter. Why? I asked. Because, David said with a predatory grin, that's how you let the enemy walk deeper into the trap. She's already committed numerous blunders. We want to give her the opportunity to commit a fatal one. He sent the letter via certified mail. Return receipt requested. The signed receipt, confirming Karen had personally received the communication, came back 5 days later. I clipped it into the binder. The trap was set. All we had to do now was wait for the target to take the bait. The response was not long in coming, and it was exactly what David had predicted. A sane person would have retreated. Karen doubled down. She was too invested, her ego too fragile to admit a mistake. To her, our letter was not a warning shot. It was an insult, a challenge to her authority, and she responded with an act of breathtaking stupidity. It happened on a Tuesday. I had gone into town for my weekly supply run. I was gone for perhaps 3 hours. When I returned, pulling down my long gravel driveway, I knew instantly that something was wrong. The spot under the black walnut tree where my grandfather's F-100 always sat was empty. There were tire tracks in the grass, heavier and wider than my own, and a few scuff marks on the turf. The truck was gone. For a moment, I just sat in my daily driver, the engine idling, and stared at the empty space. This was no longer about paper threats and bureaucratic nonsense. This was theft. She had crossed a bright, unambiguous line from civil harassment into felony territory. My methodical calm, the bedrock of my entire operational plan, was severely tested. A hot, primal anger flared in my chest. I took a deep breath, forced it down, and converted it into cold, hard fuel. My first call was not to David. It was to the sheriff's office. I reported a vehicle stolen from my private property. A deputy arrived 20 minutes later, a young man who looked like he was barely out of his teens. He took my statement, looked at the tire tracks, and seemed appropriately concerned. He ran the vehicle's VIN. "Well, this is unusual, Colonel Thorne," he said, looking up from his patrol car's computer. "Your truck hasn't been reported stolen by another agency, but it was towed. Dispatch shows a call placed by a Ms. Karen Miller, president of the Whispering Pines, HOA, to A1 Towing and Recovery. They impounded it." "Deputy," I said, keeping my voice level with considerable effort, "did she report it as an abandoned vehicle on a public road?" "No, sir. The notes say nuisance vehicle removal from private community property." "And did you happen to notice, as you drove a quarter-mile down my private driveway to this spot, that this is not, in fact, part of her private community property?" The deputy had the good grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. It's clear you're not in the subdivision. Look, I'm just telling you what the call log says. Since it was a tow and not a theft, it's a civil matter. You'll have to take it up with the HOA and the tow company." "A civil matter?" I repeated, my voice dropping. "Deputy, a woman with no legal authority over my property hired a company to come onto my land and remove a $30,000 piece of private property without my consent. In what world is that not grand theft auto?" "Sir, I understand your frustration," he said, shifting his weight. "My advice would be to contact a lawyer." He handed me a card with an incident number on it. "I'll file a report documenting our conversation and the circumstances." He then got in his car and left, a public servant retreating from a problem that was too complicated for his shift. The incident report number was a crucial piece of evidence, but his retreat crystallized a hard truth. The system was not designed to proactively protect me. I had to force its hand. My second call was to David Chen. I relayed the events concisely. He was silent for a moment, and then I heard a low whistle on the other end of the line. "She did it," he said, his voice filled with a lawyer's grim satisfaction. "She stepped right into the kill box. This is the fatal blunder we were waiting for. Do not, under any circumstances, contact the tow yard or pay to retrieve your truck. That could be construed as acknowledging their right to tow it. Just sit tight. We're going on the offensive. Immediately." While David began drafting the necessary legal documents for a lawsuit and a restraining order, I turned my attention to a more immediate and symmetrical form of retribution. Karen had used her own rules, misapplied as they were, as a weapon against me. It was time to turn those weapons back on her. I retrieved my copy of the HOA covenants, already heavily annotated, and turned to the section on parking. It was, like most of the document, draconian and specific. Section 14. Subsection B. Parking is permitted in designated areas only. At no time shall any vehicle be parked in designated fire lanes, on grass verges, or in any manner that obstructs community sidewalks. The penalty was immediate towing at the owner's expense. I knew from my reconnaissance walks that Karen considered herself above such petty rules. Her vehicle, a massive and ostentatiously white luxury SUV, was a fixture in the fire lane next to the community clubhouse. She parked it there for convenience when she was inside, lording over her domain. I took my camera, a high-quality digital model with a good telephoto lens, and drove to the entrance of the subdivision. I parked legally on the public street and walked in. Sure enough, there it was, the white whale of an SUV parked squarely in the red-painted fire lane, not a foot or two over the line, but entirely within it. I took a dozen pictures from multiple angles, making sure to capture the "no parking" fire lane stenciling on the curb, her license plate, and the clubhouse in the background for context. The camera's timestamp function was, of course, enabled. Next, I went home and drafted a formal, polite, and utterly damning violation report. I cited Section 14, subsection B. I attached glossy 8x10 prints of the photographs. I wrote it not as an angry neighbor, but as a concerned citizen, worried about emergency vehicle access. As per the HOA's own bylaws, a documented violation submitted by any resident had to be acted upon by the board. I addressed the report not to Karen, but to the HOA's secretary, a woman who, according to my notes, seemed to be one of the nervous hostages. I sent it via email, creating a digital time-stamped record, and then drove to the post office and sent a hard copy via certified mail. Then I took the final step. I looked up the number for A1 Towing and Recovery, the same company she had used. I explained that I was reporting a violation on behalf of the Whispering Pines community safety standards. I cited the relevant bylaw and explained that a vehicle was blocking a designated fire lane. I emailed them the photographic evidence. The dispatcher, without a hint of irony, said they'd have a truck out there within the hour. I did not stick around to watch. The best operations are the ones you set in motion and then leave, allowing the enemy's own systems and procedures to complete the work for you. I went home, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat on my porch, looking at the empty spot where my truck used to be. It was an acceptable loss, a pawn sacrificed to take the queen. The fallout from her blunder was about to begin. But a new piece of intelligence was already on its way, a message from a defector within her own ranks that would turn this from a simple tactical victory into a complete and utter rout. The kill shot was coming. The call came that evening. The number was blocked, and the voice on the other end was nervous and quiet, almost a whisper. "Is this Colonel Thorne?" "This is he." "Colonel, my name is Arthur Pinter. I'm the treasurer of the Whispering Pines HOA." He sounded terrified. "I received a copy of that letter from your lawyer. I tried to talk to Karen, to tell her she was going too far, but she wouldn't listen. She's out of control. After what she did today with your truck, I can't be a party to this anymore. It's not right. It's not legal." I listened, saying nothing, letting the silence draw him out. This was a critical moment. Arthur was the inside source, the conscience-stricken subordinate who could provide the keys to the kingdom. "She's been cooking the books, Colonel," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not in a sophisticated way, but she's been using the HOA's general fund as her own personal piggy bank. She set up a shell company, Karen's Creative Landscaping, and she pays them a monthly beautification consulting fee. There is no landscaping. It's just her. And the tow truck today, she paid for it out of the reserve account. She's using our money to fund her personal vendettas. This was it. This was the kill shot. Her actions against me were an abuse of power. This was felony embezzlement. "Mr. Pinter," I said, my voice calm and reassuring, "you're doing the right thing. Do you have access to the records, bank statements, invoices?" "I have everything," he said, a note of resolve entering his voice. "I have copies of the checks she wrote to herself. I have the invoice from the tow company. I can get them to you." We arranged a discreet meeting for the following morning at a coffee shop in the next town over. I told him to make copies of everything and to bring them on a thumb drive as well. When I hung up the phone, I walked over to the binder. I created a new section, tab 5, and labeled it Financial Irregularities. Karen had made the classic mistake of every petty tyrant. She believed that the rules were for other people. She believed the treasury was her personal reward for service, and she had underestimated not just me, but the quiet decency of the people she thought she controlled. Her little empire was about to come crashing down around her. The public takedown was now not just a possibility, it was a strategic necessity. The emergency community meeting was Karen's idea, another spectacular, hubristic blunder. Enraged that her own car had been towed from the fire lane, an action she correctly, but impotently, attributed to me, and panicked by the initial inquiries from David's lawsuit, she decided her best defense was a massive public offense. She called a special meeting of all Whispering Pines residents. The stated purpose, according to the notice slipped under every door, was twofold. First, to officially declare me, Marcus Thorne, a hostile non-community actor, and second, to vote on a special assessment of $200 per household to create a legal defense fund to fight my frivolous and harassing lawsuit. It was a show trial. She intended to use the public forum to demonize me, rally the residents to her cause, and get them to pay for the consequences of her own illegal actions. She had no idea that we had spent the last 48 hours turning her show trial into an ambush. The final battleground was the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. The air was thick with the scent of cheap air freshener and simmering resentment. I arrived early, along with David Chen, Mrs. Gable, the Martinez family, and a half-dozen other residents I had spoken to. Arthur Pinter was already there, sitting near the back, looking pale but determined. My insurgency was now a small army. David set up a laptop and a projector at a small table near the front. Karen, watching him from her seat at the head table with her 2 remaining loyal board members, glared at him. "What is this? This is not on the agenda." David smiled a placid, infuriating smile. "Just ensuring we're prepared for a productive discussion, Madam President. Audio-visual aids." The room filled up quickly. Nearly every household was represented. Karen had promised fireworks, and no one wanted to miss it. She banged a small, toy-like gavel on the table, the sound barely audible over the chatter. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association will now come to order." She launched into a tirade that was even more unhinged than I had anticipated. She painted me as a hostile outsider, a belligerent recluse who was actively trying to destroy their peaceful community. She claimed my junkyard property was driving down their home values. She described my illegal reporting of her car as a vindictive act of harassment. She held up the invoice for the towing of her SUV. "This man is costing you money. He is attacking your community. He is attacking me, your duly elected president, who works tirelessly to protect your investment." She spoke for 15 minutes, her voice growing shriller with each sentence. When she finally finished, red-faced and panting slightly, she pointed a trembling finger at me. "It is time for this community to stand up to this bully. I call for a vote on the special assessment of $200 to fund our fight against him." Before anyone could second the motion, David Chen stood up. "Point of order, Madam President." Karen looked at him with pure venom. "You are not a resident here. You have no standing." "I am here as legal counsel for a resident, Mr. David Martinez," David said smoothly, gesturing to David, who nodded. "And as such, I am permitted to speak on his behalf. Before the community votes to spend thousands of dollars on a lawsuit, they are entitled to be fully informed about the facts of the case they would be funding. Surely you believe in transparency, Madam President. She was trapped. Denying him the right to speak would look like she had something to hide. Fine, she spat. 5 minutes. Thank you, David said. He walked to the podium and clicked the remote for the projector. The first slide illuminated the screen behind Karen's head. It was the certified county plat map. These are the facts, David began, his voice calm and authoritative, filling the room. Fact 1. Colonel Thorne's property is not, and has never been, a part of the Whispering Pines HOA. As you can see from the official county map, your authority ends at his property line. Therefore, any action taken against him or his property using HOA resources is illegitimate. He clicked to the next slide. It was a high-resolution scan of the letter from the Georgia Department of Environmental Protection. Fact 2. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, illegally ordered Colonel Thorne to destroy a state-protected waterway. This action, had it been carried out, would constitute a felony and result in fines of up to $50,000 per day, payable by the association, that is, by you. A low murmur went through the crowd. Fact 3, David continued, clicking to a slide showing the sheriff's incident report. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, hired a third party to enter Colonel Thorne's private land and steal his private property. This is not a nuisance tow. This is grand theft auto, a felony for which she, and any board members who approved it, can be held personally, criminally liable. The murmuring grew louder. Karen was sputtering, trying to object, but David spoke over her. Now, you might think this is just a dispute with one man, but let's talk about the pattern of conduct. He nodded to me. I stood up. I didn't go to the podium. I just stood at my seat. My name is Marcus Thorne. I am not your enemy. I simply wish to be left in peace. But your president has engaged in a campaign of harassment, and I am not the only one. I looked toward Mrs. Gable. She stood, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice clear. She fined me $200 for a garden gnome. She called my late husband's memorial flag non-compliant. David Martinez stood. She tried to force my 5-year-old daughter's swing set to be painted in earth tones. She is fining us $50 a week until we comply. One by one, a half-dozen other residents stood and told their stories. The basketball hoop, the off-color mailbox, the holiday decorations left up 2 days too long. The pattern became undeniable, a tapestry of petty tyranny and abuse woven by one person. The mood in the room had shifted from a spectacle to a tribunal. Then came the coup de grace. David clicked to the final series of slides. And now, he said, his voice dropping, let's talk about why you are really being asked for a special assessment. The first image was a scanned copy of a check. It was from the Whispering Pines HOA General Fund, made out to Karen's Creative Landscaping, LLC, for $5,000. The memo line read, Beautification Consulting. This company, David said, was incorporated by Karen Miller 3 months ago. It has no employees, and its registered address is a P.O. box. She has been paying herself $5,000 of your money every month. A collective gasp went through the room. The next slide was the invoice from A1 Towing for my F-100. It clearly showed the bill was sent to the HOA. The slide after that was a bank statement, showing the payment for that tow coming directly from your reserve funds. Karen did not just tow Colonel Thorne's truck, David announced, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. She made you pay for it. She used your money to commit a felony in her own name." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Karen, whose face had gone from crimson rage to a pasty, sickly white. She was staring at Arthur Pinter, who refused to meet her gaze. She knew she was finished. David held up a hand for silence. "The motion on the floor is for a special assessment. I would like to propose an amendment to that motion. I move that we approve a special assessment, not for a legal defense fund, but for a full, independent, forensic audit of this association's finances for the last 2 years." "Second!" shouted David Martinez. Karen, speechless, could only watch as the vote was called. It was a deafening, unanimous aye. "Point of order," I called out over the din. The room quieted, looking at me. "According to Section 4, subsection B of your own bylaws, a vote of no confidence in the President and Board can be called at any special meeting, provided a quorum of residents is present. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence and the removal of Karen Miller and her board, effective immediately." Mrs. Gable, her voice ringing with newfound courage, shouted, "I second the motion." The result was a formality. The vote was a roar of catharsis, a wave of ayes that washed away her entire reign of terror. She was stripped of her power, publicly and humiliatingly, in the very room she had designed for my destruction. She grabbed her purse and fled the clubhouse without another word, her sycophantic board members trailing in her wake like pilot fish abandoning a dead shark. The siege was over. We had won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the vacuum of power left by Karen's spectacular implosion, the community acted with a clarity and purpose that had long been suppressed. Before the meeting even adjourned, David Martinez nominated Arthur Pinter to serve as the interim treasurer and head a temporary board. Mrs. Gable was nominated and tearfully accepted a position as well. A new, reasonable government was elected by popular acclaim right there on the spot. Their first official act, passed by unanimous vote, was to void every single fine issued by Karen's board over the previous year. A wave of palpable relief washed over the room. People were smiling, shaking hands, clapping each other on the back. The oppressive atmosphere had not just lifted, it had been shattered. The interim board's second act was a formal motion to issue a written apology to me, to be delivered to my home and posted on the community bulletin board, for the harassment and property theft I had endured. They also voted to cover all costs associated with the recovery of my F-100, including any fees and a full professional detail to repair any damage done by the tow. For Karen, the consequences were far more severe. The forensic audit, which began the following week, uncovered over $70,000 in embezzled funds. Armed with the audit and a sworn affidavit from Arthur Pinter, the new board filed a criminal complaint. Karen was arrested and charged with multiple counts of felony theft by conversion. David Chen, on my behalf, filed a civil suit against her personally for the theft of my truck and damages. Faced with overwhelming evidence and mounting legal bills, she was forced to sell her oversized beige house to pay for her defense. Her reign of distinction ended not with a bang, but with a for sale sign planted in her perfectly manicured lawn. The change in Whispering Pines was almost immediate. The air of oppressive conformity vanished, replaced by a sense of liberation. The Martinez's daughter's swing set was repainted a brilliant, unapologetic yellow. Mrs. Gable's garden gnome was soon joined by a whole family of them, standing proudly amongst her roses. People started leaving their garage doors open. Kids left their bikes on the lawn. It began to look less like a sterile movie set and more like a real neighborhood, a place where people actually lived. 2 weeks after the meeting, there was a community barbecue held on the green space by the clubhouse. I was invited as the guest of honor. I almost declined. My desire for solitude was still strong, but I knew it was important. It was a peace treaty, a symbolic gesture to close the book on the conflict. I drove my newly recovered F-100, gleaming and clean, and parked it right at the edge of the lawn. Nobody said a word about it being an eyesore. Instead, men gathered around, admiring the restored engine and asking about its history. I brought a large cooler filled with bottles of water and lemonade. I had filled it that morning with ice made from the pure, cold water of my spring. When I offered a bottle to Mrs. Gable, she smiled. "From the famous spring," she said, "a little taste of freedom." That evening, back at Thorne's stand, I sat on my porch and watched the last rays of the sun filter through the canopy of my unmanaged timber. The quiet was back, but it was different now. It was a deeper, more profound quiet. It was not the peace of withdrawal, but a peace that had been fought for and won. The binder, Operation Spring Freedom, sat on the small table beside my chair. It was a hefty, satisfying weight. I picked it up and carried it over to the stone fire pit my grandfather had built. I didn't need it anymore. The campaign was over. Its purpose was served. I opened the cover and, page by page, I fed it to the flames. I watched the violation notices, the plat maps, the legal threats, and the financial records curl, blacken, and turn to ash. I watched Karen's smug face on her welcome letter distort and disappear into the fire. It was a final decommissioning, a laying down of arms. The war for my peace was over. I had been forced from my retirement, called back to service to defeat a petty tyrant who threatened not just my land, but the very idea of community. I had used the skills of my old life, strategy, preparation, and the relentless application of pressure, to dismantle her little empire of fear. In the end, it wasn't a lawyer or a lawsuit that truly defeated her. It was the truth, meticulously documented and presented to the very people she sought to control. She was brought down by her own rules, her own arrogance, and the simple, quiet courage of a few good neighbors who had finally had enough. The fire crackled. The ashes of the binder swirled up into the darkening sky, and I was finally, truly, at peace.